is removed, then we're going to move into retouching her skin. So you've got your blemishes layer. You're going to copy that layer, okay, and then I'm going to rename it something like retouch or skin retouch or something like that, so that I know what's going on in that layer. I'm going to go in and change the blend mode over here to vivid light. It's going to create a very intense look. I'm going to invert that, Command I. It's going to look something like this. Then I'm going to go and add a high pass filter, and I want it to be set at 24. And then I'm going to add a blur on top of that. So I'm going to go in and add a Gaussian blur at 3 pixels and hit OK. Once I've got this, then I'm going to double click on the thumbnail for the layer, that little square right there. And then I'm going to adjust on this bar right here. But to adjust that, I'm going to actually hold the Option key down while I adjust, which will split the adjustment toggles in half, which will therefore allow me to do a little bit more customization on my retouching rather than moving the whole slider. Once I've got something that looks something like this, and again, you can go in and look and double check and see that that's where you want it. You can keep adjusting more or less on each side. I'm going to hit OK. And then we have an image that is completely retouched, which is not necessarily what we want. We want just her skin retouched. So I'm going to go in and add a layer mask and invert it. Once I've inverted that, I'm going to grab my paintbrush. Okay, I start with a hard brush, high opacity, with white as the primary color. I go in here and I start with a little bit of a bigger brush. And I do that just to get kind of the preliminary stuff done. Again, if you don't hit the edges perfectly, it's okay for this first round, that's fine, but you want to hit them eventually. Make sure you get the cheek done and all that stuff. As you're doing this, make sure you avoid the very, very edge of the nose, and I'm going to go in and finish that up and sharpen that up in a minute. But you want to get her nose, but not the very edge. You want to avoid the eyes, but it's okay to do the underside in here. Again, I'm going to go in and fix that in a minute. You want to avoid the eyelashes. Again, those are hair. It doesn't need to be retouched. You can do this section in between the eye and the eyebrow. I'll get to that in a minute with a softer brush. I'm going to make the brush a bit bigger to do the forehead. Again, don't worry about the edges just yet. Just do a basic cursory brush around the face. You want to make sure you're filling in your details. Sometimes that means a bit of a bigger brush to kind of make sure you've got all the areas. Remember that you can option click on your mask to see what you have and have not filled in. So I can go in and click on that to make sure I get that whole spot. I'm going to make that brush smaller again so I can do this side of her face. Remember, you don't want to do the eyes, you don't want to do the eyebrows, you don't want to do any of the hair, and you don't want to do the mouth in any way. You can do other skin that shows, like her neck or things like that. It just depends on how much is showing and what's going to look most appropriate. Once you've got that kind of finished, I'm going to go in with a smaller brush against the edge of her lip and finish that up. Again, given that she's wearing a darker lipstick, I have that opportunity to go at that with a harder brush, whereas if she was wearing a more natural color, or she wasn't wearing any lipstick, then I would have to go at it with a softer brush to get that edge to be less intense. And I may still do that at the end just to clarify where things should be. Remember, you want to avoid that line of the nose. Okay, you want to keep that a crisp line if possible. Again, you may need to adjust the brush sizes as you go. And by the time you're done, it should look something like this. And again, this is just my first round around her face. I want to check and make sure I didn't miss anything. Obviously I did, so I'm going to go in and fix those areas that I missed. Try to avoid areas if you don't know, like her nose. I don't know what I can and can't go over, so I'm going to avoid that for right now. And that should be good to go. Now I'm going to flip it back, grab a softer brush, and go in and just do the last kinds of things. So I'm going to go around like the edge of her face. That softer brush, that's going to make those edges a little bit cleaner looking. bottom of her face is less important because of her chin. I want to make sure I got all of this in here. I'm going to go under her eye, grab any of that skin that I missed in that. I'm actually going to make this much smaller and go into this area in here. Again, this area is kind of a tough one. If you don't want to do it, it's understandable, but you want to get just the very edges of it. I'm going to go around that eyebrow. She has very distinctly shaped eyebrows, so I can go right up against them. If you're not sure, do your best to avoid them, because the last thing you want to do is over retouch an area. I'm going to go right up against her hairline because I've got that softer brush, so it's going to feather a little bit and it's not going to create such a harsh edge. Depending on the face of the person you're working with, this can be an easier step versus a harder step. I'm going to go up against this eyebrow, same as the other side. As you can see, that kind of gets rid of that harsher line that appears. I'm going to make that brush really small again and go thread through this area here. And again, you want to avoid sections like this where you can kind of see the skin that's retouched versus not retouched. That's what that softer brush does, is it allows you to kind of come through that. I'm going to come under her eye here. Oh, wrong this way. I'm going to come under this, kind of retouch in this area here with that softer brush. And then the only area I think I have left to do is her nose. I know her mouth, especially at the top, could use a little bit of work. This side over here. And then last, her nose. Her nose is, like I said, a tricky one, but you do want to avoid having that crease of like areas that have been retouched versus areas that haven't. And I'm going to come right through this. I'm going to come underneath her nose and do the same thing. And that's just working with a softer brush versus a harder brush, a crisp edge versus a smooth edge. And then now if I option click on that mask, you can see it's a little bit more distinct. I can go into areas that I know I've missed still and kind of fix those. There's some areas that are very clear that I've missed, others that I'm not sure about, so I can go back in with a different kind of brush or adjust it, things like that. I recognize that I missed a section of her chin in here. I'll make that brush a bit bigger. Come through here and double check that I got her whole chin. And then we should be good to go. Yep, okay. And that is skin retouching. The last thing I do is, depending on the kind of portrait, I don't want her to look over retouched, which I believe she does in this. So I lower the overall opacity of the layer to bring back a little bit more so you can see all the way down to the original versus up at what we just retouched, and it looks a little overdone. So I'm going to go down to her about 50%. It depends on your person and the type of portrait. This is an outdoor portrait, so I want it to be a little bit more natural looking, which is why I go lower. Sometimes studio portraits can be a little bit more formal.